Well, hello and welcome to today's HIPAA Chat, Self-Auditing for HIPAA, Auditing Your Charts, Auditing Your Network. I'm Carol Fly with HIPAA Answers. Thanks for joining us again for our monthly HIPAA Chat Q&A. It's a big topic today, a lot of folks on the line, so it's going to be a fast and furious hour for sure. HIPAA Chat is sponsored by eFax Corporate, founded in 1995, the award-winning leading provider of internet services through its two divisions, Business Cloud Services and Digital Media. We thank them for their sponsorship. Without eFax Corporate, we would not be able to bring our show to you. So we're glad to have them on board, as always.
Yay!
Yay! Of course, HIPAA Chat is hosted by Steve Spearman, really familiar face in the health IT space, works with some of the RECs, and we rely on him for his advice and counsel when we have a HIPAA question from HITech Answers. And you can check out his website, of course, healthsecuritysolutions.com. Contact and email him. He loves to be bothered by email. Call him. I'll even have his phone number at the end. Call him. And make sure you check out his monthly webinars on his website at healthsecuritysolutions.eventbrite.com. Hi, Steve. Our HIPAA Chat once again. The spring is in the air.
Well, yes, spring is sprung here in South Carolina for sure.
Yeah, spring is sprung. Allergy season, and we have a guest with us today, don't we? We've got Raymond Ribble. We call him Ray. Ray is co-founder of Fusion Systems Company and is a managing director of their healthcare division, All Medical Solution. Their flagship product is Sphere. And this product supports user activity monitoring and risk management. You can learn more at the website listed on this site. And, of course, contact him with any questions at the end of HIPAA Chat, Ray Ribble at allmedicalsolutions.com. Ray, welcome to HIPAA Chat. We always like to have a guest on board. And you know, Steve and I have our running Hollywood avatar joke. He's George Clooney, and I, of course, am Sandra Bullock, which everybody knows. Looking at me, right? And
I'm looking at Ray there. I'm thinking Vincent D'Onofrio. Do you know who that is, Ray?
Oh, yeah, I know who he is. Didn't he play the cockroach in the first Men in Black movie?
He did play the giant cockroach.
He did, in fact, play cockroach. And he's also about to be the bad guy in the new Daredevil series. So,
All right.
I'm not casting aspersions upon your integrity, though. Just take my word for it.
There's no relation to the giant
Unfortunately,
cockroach.
that's all I remember him for. But thank you for having me today.
It's a pleasure.
Before we dive into our questions and registrants, Steve, you always have a couple slides which we've got loaded up here. So when you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, welcome everybody. It's always a pleasure. And we decided we wanted to kind of narrow it down a little bit. I haven't approved this with Carol. We haven't talked about it. I'm hoping next month we can actually broaden it up and do a lightning round on any HIPAA topic, but we'll see how that goes. But I really felt like it's important to talk about auditing. Auditing is something that is required by the rules. So I want to talk to you about what I mean, first of all. When people hear audit, especially in healthcare, they usually are thinking like maybe a meaningful use audit that's being conducted by a Figliozzi & Company to make sure you've complied with, those requirements, or maybe it's an OCR audit, which is a HIPAA audit where the Office of Civil Rights from the Department of Health and Human Services comes on site. But that's not really what we're talking about, and nor is it really what the rules, the regulations are really talking about. They're talking about self-auditing, and they're in the HIPAA security rules. There are two pertinent standards or safeguards. The first one is the Information System Activity Review Standard. It's actually not a standard. It's actually an implementation specification under the Process Management Standard, but it says you have to implement procedures to regularly review records of information system activities such as audit logs, access reports, and security incident tracking reports. So it basically is a requirement that you need to have an ability and to actually conduct audits so that people can, so you can know who did what within your system. And then related to that is the audit control standard. That's a technical, that's under the technical specifications. It says implement hardware, software, and or procedural mechanisms that record and examine activity in information systems that contain or use EPHI. So, and I also added one other thing. So, as you know, I would imagine most of the providers on this call are using a certified electronic health record, which is another thing that came out of meaningful use. And that basically requires electronic health records to have an auditing capability, and specifically, it had an ability to enable a user to create an audit report for a specific time period and to sort entries in the audit log according to each of the data specified in the standards. So basically, with what we're talking about is we are not talking about OCR audits, MU audits, JCO audits. We're talking about your ability to and conducting of audits that allow you to know who's been doing what within your system. And so one of the things that, kind of skips to a lot of issues that, you have to think about, like, what are the information systems functions that adequately use and monitor to promote continual awareness of the activity in your systems? What are the logs? These are the kinds of things that you would address in your policies. What are the audit logs and activity review functions and reports in your current system? Is there a policy that establishes how the reviews will be conducted? Is there a procedure within that policy that describes the specifics of the reviews? Things like the frequency. Do you need to do these once a month, once a quarter? What are the trigger events? One thing that's really clear is that some organizations, many organizations, if you're going to do what I call reactive audits, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but if you're going to do those, you need to say, what are the kinds of things where we need to decide that we're going to go and look and see what happened? And so, as an example, some of you may remember the Congresswoman Gifford that was shot in the face a few years ago. Yeah, very tragic. And 5 people at that hospital lost their jobs because they went and looked at her record, and they weren't supposed to, and they did it because the hospital's policy was that an incident involving a famous person or a high-profile event required them to do an audit of her record, and they found 5 people that had no real appropriate reason to be, to have access to that chart. So that, that's an example. And then I want more clients. One reason I invited Ray on is I'd like more to consider the question about what can we do to help automate the process. And there's some interesting questions around that. My view is even if somebody has a good policy, very, very often my clients aren't actually doing it. They may have something on a shelf that they're doing, but you need to actually be doing that. And so, so some of the things that you want to consider is what I call random versus systematic. So random would be like you're going to randomly select charts to see, who's done it. It might be random staff, it might be random patients, but you're going to select a random number of charts versus systematic, and that would be an approach where you're going to review certain records, like, hey, we're going to review all of our first 10 A records. That would be a more systematic approach. And these, again, are the kinds of things you might include in a policy. Retrospective versus real time. And I'm going to probably leave that a little bit off to Ray to talk about. But, a lot of times when we think of auditing, we are talking about retrospective audits. And it's going and seeing what's happened in the past versus the third thing, maybe alerting versus monitoring versus reviewing. An alert is in many ways ideal. It's going to say, hey, there's something happening here that maybe you ought to look at. Reactive versus proactive, that's scheduled, what we're talking about. Network versus chart. I actually think we'll probably get into this a little bit more during the HIPAA chat today. But let me just say, though, a lot of the conversation that happens in healthcare around HIPAA security is driven by IT vendors, maybe the IT department, and often their focus is on network audits. like who's accessed the network, looking at like control logs, or and I don't want to diminish that. That's important. But I think in many ways the intention of the rules was to focus more on what's happening within the record. And you kind of see that by having that requirement within the certified EHR. And then trigger events, I've already mentioned. What are the kinds of events that you want to define that would trigger an audit? And then automated versus procedural. And we'll get more into that as we go into that. Procedural being, hey, it's a step-by-step process we've defined versus, can we automate this? So.
Well, it's a big topic we're covering today. It's a lot of stuff, and so we're gonna go ahead and dive right in. Again, the questions that we're starting with, to remind our attendees, were submitted during the registration process. If we have time, we'll obviously grab some questions that will be asked during today's event. Steve, Ray, I'm just going to jump right in. So Sandra from New Jersey wants to know, is there a preferred audit framework recommended by OCR, the Office of Civil Rights?
Okay, so let's talk about OCR. So OCR, in putting the word audit and OCR together, typically that makes me think of an OCR audit. And the good news is there is a protocol that's been published around that. Now that protocol is being updated because they're going to start stage 2 of the OCR audit program this year, and there's been a lot of discussion about what that's going to look like. But basically, essentially though, I think the way that it may not be the intention of the caller, but the way I'm going to answer that is to answer this question. If you were being audited by OCR, what would they look for you to be doing from an audit standpoint? In other words, what would you have to prove to them? And basically, we've kind of covered that ground. You'd need to prove to them that you conduct audits, that you have a defined policy procedure for conducting audits, that you have documents indicating that you've done audits, and that you could show that to them. I have a working definition of compliance that I pull up all the time. Compliance is having policies and procedures that are mapped to the regulations, that follow the findings of your risk analysis, that are followed and documented. So in the case of the audit requirements within the regulations, OCR auditors are going to care that you're conducting them and that you can prove that you're conducting them and that you have policy covering that. I do want to say that aside from compliance alone, I think this may be a good question to go into why auditing is important, why every security framework has stuff on auditing. And so the real drivers are, one is that if you have something happen, you need to be able to determine what happened. So that's what you do, is you go and audit the record. You say, yeah, Congresswoman Gifford here, let's go look at the record. So it's to be able to research incidences. But the other reason you audit is you want to discover inappropriate access. You want to basically go and say, let's look at this art, and these charts, look at maybe the event of the logs of its staff, and say, was there any inappropriate access? But one of the things I think is often missed is that the reason you do that is to help your staff to be a check on their behavior. That they know that if you're doing audits, that they're not going to go into that chart, even though they really want to know what is going on with their neighbor that was in the office yesterday, because they know that it's going to be caught, or that could be. And that's one reason that I think, from a procedural standpoint, if your audits are either not happening at all, or they're just not frequent enough, or they're not enough charts, people will do it anyway. Right. Because people do it anyway because they know they won't get caught. So, I think it's, Ray, why don't you tell them a little bit about your experience? I mean, this is where you live and breathe.
Well, yeah, and Steve, I like what you were saying, and I have 3 things that I would add to that for everybody. When we look at this, and we've worked with providers here on the West Coast of the United States, over 2,000 providers through the HITECH program, let's just take what Steve said, and there's 3 things I'd like everybody to remember. One is, in terms of preparing for an OCR audit, you want to promote a culture of compliance among the staff in your organization. So not just the threats that it might happen, but start creating an environment where everybody is truly learning what is to be expected of them if and when an OCR, a CMS, or a meaningful use audit were to take place within their organization. Second, once you start enforcing this culture of compliance, it reinforces the training, the compliance training that your organization might be involved in or might have taken, and then it tells you where you need to fill the gaps in terms of additional training that will take place in the future. And the third point that I would probably make is you don't want to wait until, and I think Steve, you said this at the very beginning, you don't want to wait until after it's happened. When the OCR auditor comes in, one of the things they're going to be looking for, we've seen this on numerous occasions with our clients, is they will ask right away, show me an example of an incident that took place in your environment where EPHI was unauthorized access took place. Show me how you conducted that investigation, and show me the notations that you took accordingly and the actions you took to correct that to prevent it from happening in the future. And that goes to your point, Steve, about policies and procedures, and to my point about creating this culture of compliance. When people can do that and do that consistently and show different examples across the business of what they're doing, then you're going to find that red alert level from the OCR auditor drops pretty fast.
All righty.
Carol, we covered that one, didn't we? Completely.
We did. We did.
There's no stone left unturned with that one.
Well, as we know, I don't think we've ever had a HIPAA chat where we didn't talk about the OCR. So, obviously, yeah. But it's a good segue into the next question, which is, this is from Jackie from Pennsylvania. What are the top 3 to 5 areas that we should be self-auditing? How frequently and how granular should it go?
Okay, so first of all, from an action point, you need to have a procedure in place that answers those questions. Secondly, it's impossible for me or anybody to know that without knowing your organization. Because there are a lot of factors that go into this, and let me give you an example. One of the benefits of being a small practice is that you're kind of in everybody's business. In other words, everybody's kind of in everybody's business. That can have something of a check. That can help kind of, check what people are going to do. But when organizations get larger, it's much more anonymous, randomized, things. And so that the procedure that's going to work there will be different. Ray, Ray, would you agree with that? I mean, what's your take?
Yeah, I would. I think your answer is exactly like mine. You're talking everything from a small private practice all the way up to a large hospital enterprise. So things change a great deal in between all of that. What we try to tell everybody, because we work predominantly with smaller practices, clinics, FQHCs across the United States, is we try to tell them, look, it starts with roles and responsibilities of your staff. So it kind of goes back to the first question from one of the listeners with regard to audit. And if you can identify the roles and responsibilities, even though everybody is going to wear everybody else's hat on a given occasion, vacation, whatever takes place, somebody's out sick, the fact that you can show that there is a process in place for who's doing what work on what days, and then you can show anomalies that take place in their work patterns, the workflow that they have associated with their job, and why they access information on certain occasions. That goes a long way to showing that you understand what's happening in your business. So when I think about the top 3 to 5 areas, the first thing that I want to address is just what does everybody do on a normal day? That's my number one thing that I want to look at. And then based on that criteria, I might start to drill down into, well, who's responsible for finance versus who's responsible for actually working together with the patients when they go into the various examination rooms. Because those individuals on a day-to-day basis are going to see different types of EPHI, some financial, some very specific to the patient's record. And they're working with different sections of the EHR or any other third-party EPHI system that they come into contact with. So that would be my real knee-jerk reaction to that type of question. But I couldn't agree with you more, Steve, that it just varies because everybody's very different in the way that they practice medicine.
And I would think that frequency question, that frequency part of it, like, you know, there would be the regularly scheduled frequency depending on you know what you're doing as a practice or a hospital, but also getting back to Steve's slide about there are certain trigger events or trigger incidents that are actually going to make you or prompt you to do another self-audit, correct?
Oh, I mean, a good policy will have those.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, this is off the top of my head. But like it would include things like, you know, high-profile events, high-profile patients. It could be termination. So let's say a person terminate a non-voluntary termination. Well, you may want to audit and see, was this person doing things they ought not to have done? You know, so you know, coming up with those kinds of lists is good. And really to get back to the question too, it's like, you know, your purpose is, as we said, is research, to discover, and then to prevent. And so you're basically looking for activities that are what in audit language they call it exceptions. You want to look for things that are outside of the norm and outside of what's proper, what's outside of accepted behavior consistent with policy and the regulations. And so, those are going to be, like we talked about, like who accessed what record, what did they do. It's worth noting you have to have a robust ability to do this. I mean, under the privacy rules, you actually have to be able to do provide a complete audit of, you know, if a patient requests it, you know, who's looked at my chart. You have to have an ability to provide that information. So these capabilities are important. And I want to add as an aside that one reason that the rules are so clear and unambiguous about access controls, in other words, you're not being able to share a username and password, is because of this issue of auditing. If you've got, you know, a doctor that, you know, has, you know, an assistant that he's given his password to or whatever, you know, and it shows up in an audit, you don't really know who did what. So, you know, auditing is important for integrity, and integrity is important for auditing. And so, you know, it's an important principle that kind of supports what you need to be.
Yeah, can I support that a little bit, Steve? One thing that I'd like to say is once you start down that path and you start to create the culture of compliance that I spoke of earlier, the staff becomes aware of that fact. And as you were saying, the frequency can be triggered by a couple of different events that takes place within the organization. And when everybody in the staff knows that, hey, there's various triggers that are going to happen, they become much more proactive versus reactive with regard to monitoring what they're doing with regard to EPHI. And overall, the environment improves in terms of paying attention to those audits and what the criteria is in order to keep the organization clean from that perspective. So we find that once the organization embraces this culture, things improve a great deal. The staff becomes aware that monitoring and checks, and when they ask about the granularity and how frequent, it's going to be triggered by a various number of events that take place. Things improve overall.
Right, right. Okay, moving on. Deborah from California wants to know, what is the best way to set up email audits?
This is a really interesting question. Yeah. So first of all, let me kind of just take this opportunity to point out that if an organization, a healthcare organization, is using email, to facilitate operations, and that includes the sending of PHI, that information needs to be auditable, or maybe a better term in this case is discoverable, and it should be a system that allows for that. So we're you know, if in your office you got people using their Yahoo, personal Yahoo, and Gmail, it violates the rules on multiple levels.
Right.
It's just not allowed.
Yeah.
And I'm actually okay if an organization says, I just don't want to allow it, and we're going to disallow it. I think that that's okay. I think over a certain size it becomes unrealistic, but for a small practice it might be realistic. But for many organizations want to have the same kind of benefits of email that any business would, and you got to have an appropriate email solution. So like a hosted exchange solution would be good. There are other options, and in your policy really should address the ability to audit email. I don't think it has the same sort of I won't say urgency, but it's not as paramount as that chart auditability. But I think that to be able to discover that is useful. And what's really great is that many systems that allow for the encryption of email, and that are able to use HIPAA libraries for the discovery of those emails, they actually will give you reports that would enable that kind of audit. So it's a good question. I think it should be addressed in your policies, and there are a number of ways that you might meet a requirement like that if you've got an email system that's appropriate for the practice.
Ray, it sounded like you wanted to jump in here a little bit.
No, again, boy, Steve just covers this so well. I tend to agree with him, and I tend to believe that we recommend too often that our smaller clients try to stay away from this criteria altogether and not send any ePHI via email.
Right.
It's more when we get into the mid-sized organizations where email is a critical part of their infrastructure, and then it almost goes back to the first question with regard to framework. Then we start looking at some tools that are available out there in the market where they can afford those tools that they might use to monitor keywords and key phrases within their email systems. That gets pretty sophisticated. So again, I would tend to agree with what Steve's saying and try to follow those practices and really try to avoid it altogether.
Got it. Catherine from Georgia wants to know, speaking of tools, are there particular tools that might be recommended for use in self-auditing, some that can assist in ID anomalies? And maybe don't speak to specific vendors, but specific kind of tools.
So I mean, they're auditing tools, like you have to have an audit capability within the EHR, but none that I'm aware of that will detect anomalies, exceptions, etc. Except, Ray, do you know anything that does? Do you know of anything that maybe does that? I don't know. It's time for the shameless plug, I guess.
Ray. You can call me Ray.
Hey, Ray, just remember, we're a non-commercial entity, so This is actually one of the reasons I wanted Ray on the call. Ray's AMS Sphere is actually a very I just love what it does. I think it's a neat tool. So Ray's company can do something. You want to just do a quick kind of what's your take on that question?
Yeah, well, obviously that's the soft pitch to myself, and I want to thank that listener for asking the question. With regard to Sphere, we designed the product specifically to answer that question for our providers. The goal was to take the monitoring, the manual monitoring, away from the provider and provide them with a solution that would automate the entire process and allow for 100%, not just a partial review, but a 100% review of all of the ePHI that's being handled by the users within your environment. So we developed Sphere to look not only at your EHR, but it might look at your PAC system, it'll look at your practice management solution, it'll look at your billing system. Any system that generates or manages ePHI within your office that has an audit log associated with it, because one of the things we always tell people, remember, they provide an audit log, they're not actually auditing the audit log for you. And that's probably the biggest confusion. Stephen, you and I have talked about this many times. Many providers, many practitioners out there get confused by the marketing coming from the various organizations to say that, oh yeah, we have the audit log, you're covered there, you're compliant. From it being generated, yes, but from you actually doing the monitoring and reviewing and knowing what's happening within your environment, no. And it's a lot of work. It's very expensive to go in there and to do that, and it takes away from quality time that you want to basically apply to your patients. So it was with that in mind that we developed the Sphere product. Sphere is a very affordable solution. We sell this. Is it okay for me to say what it goes for as a market price out there, guys?
No, I think you can't take it back now. So
okay, sorry.
It's already out there.
Well, I guess the affordable part was important only from the perspective of the providers. Providers, we understand, having worked with them for 4 years in the HIPAA program, we put it out there for $80 a month for everybody to use. And the idea was that we wanted to keep the price significantly lower than what they were having to spend for their EHR environment. And what we really wanted to do was give them a solution that covered everything across their entire platform so that they could monitor. In your slide that you had earlier, Steve, you talked about the alerts, the monitoring. I mean, if you can go back to that slide, Steve nailed it. That's what we do. We send alerts to those organizations only when an incident occurs. We identify anomalies, so we're not worried about rules. We just want to find anomalies in the work pattern. Steve was talking about with Ms. Gifford in Arizona. That's a VIP function that some of the larger EHRs and EMRs provide. You pay dearly for that function, and none of the smaller EHRs have that functionality in their system. And of course, how often do we all deal with VIPs every day? So we built a solution that just hangs off that and allows you to see everything all the time. We only send you alerts. You deal with the alerts, and then we record all that information for 6 years so that if you do get audited in the future, you can pull all that information up, show that to the auditor, and allow them to understand how your policies and procedures are associated with the solution on the back end.
Yeah. It's worth mentioning a couple things, too, in line with that, is that so having a system like an EHR that can produce a log is not complying. Right. Nor is running an audit report, like if you say, okay, I want you to go run a report. That by itself doesn't comply. You'd have to actually go in and look at the log and annotate suspicious activities, that are present. And it's worth mentioning that these log reports can produce for, let's say, a week time. Some of them will produce these in like a spreadsheet type format in a single row. We'll call that a record. We'll call it a record, and that thousands of records. Right. Thousands. I mean, it's like, and because of it's looking at every kind of push of the enter key kind of is the one way to look at it.
We find that
it's very difficult to make sense.
We find that a one-private practice generates about 5,000 records per day. So if you have multiple providers, then you could be easily up to 10,000 to 15,000 a day, and somebody would have to review that to find that anomaly that you're speaking to, Steve.
Yeah, and to do that manually, again, you'd have to produce the log, and then you'd have to review it. And again, that's why we speak of randomized, because you might say, okay, we're going to review, however many, and you're just not likely to catch those anomalies. It's, unless you increase your staff or something like that.
Right. All right. Moving on, Glenn from Illinois would like to know, how would I perform an audit on users' access control to the network of shared data, and what would be the steps?
I loved the question because I had to really think, and I'm still not sure I have a great answer for that, but I'm going to kind of take an answer. So just to rephrase it, imagine you are you're a provider, and you have a shared folder where people put resources, things like that. How would you audit that? So, and Ray, you might be able to weigh into this, but one of the things that really gets to is there are tools such as SharePoint, as an example, that enhance the ability of being able to monitor and track that beyond just the standard setting up a shared folder would give you. And so there are ways and tools that you can do that. A lot of times, though, if you haven't deployed those kinds of tools, it is extremely difficult to do that. A lot of times networks they're doing all this stuff behind the scenes, and there are ways that technically what you'd even say forensically you can get at it, but it's difficult, and it's certainly not realistic for routine audits. And I do think that it is a capability that really does, I'm a big fan of actually using shared folders like that, because it facilitates better contingency plans and backing up data. I'd much rather see people, for example, if you set up a desktop, and as you're staging that for your practice, I'd like it to be staged in such a way that the My Documents saved to and offloads those to a SharePoint type file because of this kind of reason. It's easier to back it up, it's easier to audit, things like that. So it's a really, really good question. I am not completely satisfied with my answer, but I think it's important. If PHI is involved, the rules would say you need to have some auditing capability. It's not going to be anything like what you get within a record, but it's still important.
Ray?
No, the only thing I would add to what was said there is there are various levels of solutions. For those of you who are in a Microsoft environment, there is Microsoft Network that you can use that will allow you to monitor who has access to the various devices and applications that are in your environment. That will generate a log. It goes back to the point that Steve made again. You're going to still have to sit down and look at that log and ask yourself, is that allowed or was that not allowed? And then there are some various sophisticated solutions out there for the larger users, products that will monitor traffic, monitor access. Some of them are free. Some of them you have to pay for. That will allow you to do that. It is part of a much larger IT security framework that I think everybody should always consider for their business. And so again, I would just cover what Steve had to say. The level of importance is very high.
And actually, Carol, I just had one other thought too. A lot of the listeners today are probably using Active Directory. They're using which with a form of what's called domain management. And so this will be my hey, go do this today kind of advice on today's HIPAA Chat. Active Directory has natively built into it what's called security event logging, which is a simple form of logging where it'll go and look for anomalies. An anomaly in an Active Directory domain management standpoint would be like somebody attempting to log in, they put in the password incorrectly, 5 times, and
right.
That you can create that kind of log. And that's actually it's not exactly what the listener was asking, but it kind of gets in that direction of a form that probably is readily available to a lot of our listeners today that makes a lot of sense to go ahead and activate.
We're actually getting, excuse me, a number of questions from the audience using the Q&A box related to this topic, and so in fact, too many to kind of delve into with the others we've got to get through. So for those of you who are wanting more information about this particular piece of the puzzle, which is a big piece, please email both Steve and Ray offline your question, and I'm sure they'll get back to you. Kimberly from California would like to know, what would you use to execute an internal audit? I don't know if she's talking about a particular program or mechanism or bodies on the ground.
Mm-hmm. I mean, again, it's
all of the above.
The first point is a policy and procedure. You need to, to do that, and consistent with the types of, issues. And I'm going to put an offer too. If anybody on this today wants me to send a sample policy around auditing, I'd be glad to provide that. Just email me and I'll send it to you. But basically that's where it begins. But I am a fan because what happens is people put stuff. They may have a policy, but very often, I would say Ray, you can probably speak to this. For those that you've worked with that actually have, let's say, a good policy, how many of them are actually doing what their policy requires? Can you give me a percent?
Unfortunately, the answer is 0. We actually did an audit of our customer base, over 1,800 providers, and we found that 0% were actually implementing any of the policies and procedures that we had worked on with them through the Meaningful Use program. So it's not a very good answer, but that's the result.
I've had a little bit better than 0%, but I've had, I was going to get, 10%. And even in those that are doing it, their policies, may be realistic because, again, it's very tedious and time-consuming and intensive to do these, but, they're not great at actually doing what you want an audit to do. If you find an anomaly, it's pretty unusual. So,
yeah, if I can take a stab at this and help out with what you're saying, we get this question a lot, and we tell everybody start with your security risk assessment.
Oh.
Your security risk assessment will allow you to identify your vulnerabilities and your gaps. Then put together a plan, work together with your managed service partner or your IT department, whatever you have, and also the people internally within the organization. And make sure you're addressing 10, 15, 20% of those issues on an ongoing basis. Maybe you address them quarterly, maybe you address them once every 6 months, but there should be some regularity to it. It shouldn't be once a year. And then as Steve said, we want you to embed that into your policies and procedures, keep updating the policies and procedures, and also integrate that together with your internal education that you may have going on. So if it's compliance training, if it's EHR training, if it's some other third-party product, take the lessons that you're identifying from the vulnerabilities and gaps assessment, hand that off to that third party, have them integrate that in and talk about that with the staff so that you're reinforcing where the problems are and improving on that on a year-to-year or a month-to-month basis, whatever the level of frequency may be. I think that that's one way you can approach this, and I think that's how you prepare for an internal audit.
And just sort of a segue into the next question. Actually, and Steve, you touched upon this in the opening slides, but Bill from Massachusetts wanted to know, what is the importance of self-auditing? Is it just to prepare for a real audit, or are they specifically required?
Good question. We have kind of covered that. You actually have to do routine chart audits.
Right.
And so as I said to the answer to the OCR question is that OCR is going to ask to see evidence that you are conducting audits in its own audit. So yeah, you need to be, doing, regular chart audits consistent with those 3 kind of objectives is the being, researching an event, discovering, and then preventing. And so, but again, from a compliance standpoint, you need to have a policy and procedure in place, and you need to be doing that in order to comply and be able to document that you're doing it. So, and I actually say one of the things I've been asked is like, well, do I have to keep all my logs? And remember, a log can be thousands of records.
Right.
And you might do a review and it comes back and there's nothing that you find that's anomalous or whatever. Whether you want to keep the log, I think it makes sense to keep the log if there is an anomalous finding. But what you want to keep is the report that came out of that review, out of that audit process. And even if it comes back clean, say we did it on this date, and at a minimum, you want to keep that record for 6 years.
Right.
So, but yeah, it's something you're supposed to be doing.
That's the same time frame too that they can go back and audit you for MU as well, for MU incentives.
Correct.
Yeah. So sort of a really kind of a granular sort of technical question, but really interesting. What are the specific guidelines for clients that have old EPHI that's basically stored on old servers? The Mark from Florida said specifically server 2000 from 2003. Basically, it's the information is housed there for retention purposes only.
So, okay, I think that may not be. I don't know if that's asking about audits per se. So phrase this. Read it to me one more time, Carol.
Yeah, and Mark, go ahead and chat me if I'm not getting this correctly. But basically, the gist of this question is they have old PHI that is stored on a server from 2003, a virtual server from 2003.
Okay.
That the information is there for retention only. Do they have to self-audit that information, since it's about auditing?
Well, the answer to that question, because my default answer to that question is if your policies say you have to audit it. I know that seems like, so for example, to get to that, your policy, should define what needs, as I said, who, what, when, how, where, that kind of stuff. And so if they're really literally old records, it would be unusual that you'd need to audit that, unless you needed to do an audit to research an incident that has now come about. So it's interesting because you mentioned 2003, and it's an unrelated issue, but Server 2003 is going to be sunsetted this June.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to go ahead and put that out there, you guys, is that if you got a Server 2003, you need to be thinking and planning about what you're going to do about it.
Right.
And as I've said before, I mean, using an out-of-date operating system is not a violation, but you need to make sure it's included in your risk analysis and that you're mitigating the risk associated with that to the greatest extent possible. So I thought that's kind of where it's going, but a straightforward answer is what I gave.
So it'd have to be like I guess,
yeah.
If somebody steals the server, right, to trigger incident, right.
Yeah, hopefully it's in a secure location.
And who'd want it's a virtual server, so that's really what the issue is, not a if it were hacked or something, it's virtual, but not a actual hard server. So I'm going to just take a couple questions interspersed with some from the registration because we're getting quite a few in the queue. One of them is a really interesting question. If you're a practice and you conduct these self-audits, is this information now reportable? I guess if you
Okay, ask it one more time.
So if you're a practice and you conduct self-audits, a series of self-audits, is the information reportable? Okay, is it reportable? So the answer to that is if you discover as a result of your audit an incident that might be a breach, and then you follow your breach notification procedures, so that it's kind of how it tends to happen. You have an incident, and then in your incident procedure, you'll have something that'll say, is this a potential breach? Then you'll have a procedure that you go through that involves a risk analysis, actually, to determine whether a breach occurred. And if a breach occurred, then it becomes reportable. So the answer is that, at the incident level, it's not reportable. But if through the process of auditing you discover that there was a breach, breaches do have to be reported. And as I think we've covered before in a previous HIPAA chat, a breach under Omnibus, the standard that defines a breach has been lowered. So under the new standard, a breach is an unauthorized access to protected health information consistent with the privacy rules. And there are some little caveats there, but essentially that's what it looks like. So the answer is that if it isn't this is consistent with the whole compliance spiel that Ray gave. If your audit generates you find something that you want to determine whether it was a breach. This might happen with a network audit. You may
review your logs or have an alert. Maybe your IT, your solution provider, gets, hey, we did your quarterly, log review and we found some anomalous, access to your network, blah, 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 and it leads you to reporting. It's that once you determine it's a breach, then it does need to be reported. I don't want anybody to take that as a discouragement to audits. I mean, I can see how it might be tempting to lower your standards so you don't find those. Those things tend to come back one way or another, as they say. So.
Yeah, you've talked about this on every HIPAA chat, which is, the proactive approach.
Yeah, I'd much rather find something and deal with it forthrightly as opposed to having it brought to my attention by an angry patient or an auditor or whatever. So or a complaint, for example. So that good auditing can actually help with that. You can get around, help you, have processes that will, help build trust with your patient community.
Right?
Yeah, I think you start with events that take place within your organization. As Steve said, you're going to have incidents that occur. You want to capture those incidents and have them stored somewhere where in the event that somebody asks you the question, you can pull them up, show them what you learned from the incident, how you determined whether or not, in this case, I think you're going to say it was not a breach, but here are the corrective actions that we took place, and you have that on record. That's what we built into our system, was to make sure that they had a place where they could capture each of those incidents, establish a record, establish a chain of control of how that was resolved. And in fact, they can even put notes in there to say, here's the new process that we're going to implement and update as part of our policies and procedures to prevent this from happening again in the future. And then if it does become a breach, obviously it's reportable. But really the key is when you get audited, is the auditor is looking for how do you monitor, how do you control, and how do you update your policies and procedures in order to educate and prevent. And I think that goes a long way to creating that culture of compliance in your organization.
Right, right. I'm going to just take a quick question getting back to this issue of random audits. Somebody online on the call wanted to know, what approach would you recommend for a large hospital over 600 beds to use for auditing access of EPHI, random selection of patient charts to audit, etc.?
I think I'll be honest, I think an enterprise like that is like manual audits almost aren't an option. I mean,
right.
They're either, if you're doing a good job with them, it requires a whole slew of staff to do them, or a whole slew of staff to do them, or or you're not doing a good job. Ray, I don't know if you think that if that's your take, and these I'm not familiar with, but there are enterprise level tools available, right?
There are enterprise level tools. We work in that space as well. You have to automate that process. Hospitals, any hospital, they said a couple hundred beds and up, they're generating millions of lines of records per day. And think about, well, here's something to consider in this. A patient to contact ratio in a hospital is 50 to 1, where it's 5 to 1 in a private practice. So the granularity of determining whether or not an anomaly takes place and identifying whether or not any malfeasance occurred within that process is much more difficult to detect within a hospital environment than it is in a private practice. So you need some system, some algorithm that's looking at that. Think of it this way. Visa handles this every day, and they're able to determine whether or not somebody stole your credit card. You need something of that level of sophistication to determine whether or not inappropriate actions or unauthorized access of that EPHI is occurring at a hospital level.
Yeah, 600 beds is huge, obviously, but it sounds like even just exponentially the amount of data, you don't have to jump that far. Even like you said, what 100, 200 bed hospital is creating millions of bits of information.
Hey, Ray, this actually leads to ask, though, in those, when you're dealing with hospital information systems, you know, Epic or Meditech or Cerner, do they have more robust auditing capabilities internal? Do they tend to have better auditing capabilities internal? You know, there's more than just a log, or are they often missing it as well?
No, they do. Both, I can speak for Cerner and I can speak for Epic, that they both offer very good forensic tools that can be used as part of the auditing process. They're very expensive tools, I might add, but they have those tools. They're available as a module that can be extended and allow them to do very in-depth investigation. We've even partnered with some companies out there that have tools that allow you to do a drill down. So if there is an investigation, there are some third-party tools out there that will allow you to drill down at a departmental level. If anybody's interested in knowing those tools, if they want to email me, I can actually send them the URLs of the companies I'm talking about. But there are ways for you to do investigations down to the patient level or down to the practitioner level, the user level, I should say, within a hospital group.
All right. So believe it or not, our hour is just about up. For those of you who questions we didn't get to, there were a number of them asked today, as well as in the registration. Please email Steve or Ray directly. I put their emails on the screen, and I'm sure they will get. I'm sure they'll get back to you. Steve, sort of, you mentioned next month HIPAA in April that we might be doing some sort of like what, like
lightning round, maybe.
Lightning round. HIPAA lightning round.
On the spot, we didn't talk about it, but I mean, let's do 60 questions in 60 minutes.
Oh my gosh, you're killing me. Well, that sounds like that could be fun. All right.
But we need our listeners to really step up and submit those questions and, you know, all that stuff, because, you know, but yeah, and I think we'll just anything HIPAA security, shoot, I'll even add privacy. I might even take a stab at the privacy side. So
HIPAA lightning round. I do want to
HIPAA chat lightning round.
For those of you online and listening in who are regulars in HIPAA chat, and there are many of you. I think we're looking at April because of the HIMSS conference, not having HIPAA chat the third week, but probably the fourth week of April, that April 27th. So just a heads up there. Many of you have asked, will we get a recording and those slides that Steve put together for today's event? The answer is yes. I will probably get those out for sure in the next 24 hours, and will, as always, provide a YouTube video of today's HIPAA chat. Steve, Ray, any final thoughts before we close this down?
I am going to be at HIMSS, so if anybody is going to be at HIMSS and wants to, you know, meet up, just shoot me an email. And I'm currently scheduled Sunday through Tuesday, but I'd love to meet some of our listeners. So, yeah, that'd be a lot of fun.
We'll have a HIPAA chat meetup or something.
Yeah, HIPAA chat meetup. Yeah, we find out who our groupies are.
Ray, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. And for those of you,
thank you for having me.
Oh, and safe travels back to LA. Thank you to all of our HIPAA chat listeners. We appreciate your time, and we will see you next month, if not at HIMSS in Chicago. Have a good day.